Bueno, muy bien. Para dar inicio formal a esta jornada, es un placer invitar al frente a Hernando García, director general del Instituto Alexander von Humboldt, organización anfitriona de este evento.
Dear scientists, researchers, policymakers, biodiversity experts, data managers, students, representatives of indigenous people and local communities, and other participants. I extend a warm welcome to Colombia, the country of beauty and biodiversity. This beauty and richness are evidenced by some of the world's biodiversity data. Colombia is considered the world's leading country in bird, orchid, and butterfly diversity, the second highest in plant, in amphibian, freshwater, fish, reptile, bat, and palm diversity, and the third highest in plant diversity. The country also has 311 types of continental and coastal ecosystems. Therefore, we consider Colombia a leading country to bring together and represent the voices of the Global South and this important international event. As the host country, and in recognition of the great richness and beauty of our language, I will now continue my remarks in Spanish, using the technological translation facilities available at this event, if you want to use it. Como director del Instituto Alexander von Humboldt de Colombia, es un honor dirigirme a ustedes en esta conferencia internacional, un espacio de debate global que se centra en la importancia de los datos sobre biodiversidad para gestionar los desafíos de la conservación de la naturaleza, el impacto en las políticas ambientales y en la toma de decisiones frente a la actual crisis planetaria. Un espacio para potenciar el mensaje que la gestión de la biodiversidad y la acción climática son un solo desafío que no puede seguirse viendo de manera aislada. Más aún ahora a puertas de la COP30 de cambio climático en Belém do Pará, en Brasil. Quiero resaltar la importancia de esta conferencia internacional como el primer encuentro global que reúne a las 4 redes líderes mundiales sobre datos e información en biodiversidad. Voy a leerlas, voy a mencionar sus siglas, pero también voy a leerlas, que creo que será la única vez que leamos los nombres completos. Los estándares de información sobre biodiversidad, o TADWIG, la infraestructura mundial de información sobre biodiversidad, GBIF, el Sistema de Información sobre Biodiversidad Oceánica, OBIS, y la Red de Observación de la Biodiversidad del Grupo de Observaciones de la Tierra, GEOBON, que junto al Instituto Humboldt como anfitrión atenderemos el reto de abordar el ciclo completo de los datos desde la estandarización y la recopilación hasta su aplicación en investigación científica, políticas públicas y acuerdos internacionales. El Instituto Humboldt, como entidad colombiana de carácter científico vinculada al Ministerio de Medio Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, tiene como propósito central movilizar datos, información, conocimiento y narrativas que posicionan y conectan la biodiversidad y sus contribuciones con la transición hacia la sostenibilidad y el bienestar de las personas. Se consolida como una entidad de interfaz ciencia-política y de soporte para la toma de decisiones por entes de gobierno y demás actores, incluyendo el sector privado y las empresas, el sector académico y de investigación, el sector comunitario y la sociedad civil. En el marco de sus funciones, en el año 2001 el Instituto dio inicio al Sistema de Información sobre Biodiversidad, SIB Colombia, plataforma colaborativa que facilita la publicación, el acceso y uso de los datos e información sobre biodiversidad en nuestro país. De acuerdo con el SIB Colombia, a hoy se han publicado más de 39 millones de observaciones que respaldan la existencia de 80.346 especies en el territorio nacional, de las cuales 7.056 son endémicas de nuestro país, entre aves, mamíferos, peces de agua dulce y marinos, plantas y líquenes. Somos conscientes que esta es una subestimación de la diversidad real de nuestro país, la cual se estima que podría llegar a ser de cerca de 200.000 especies. Y es precisamente uno de los motivos para seguir impulsando el valor de las plataformas colaborativas de datos y a la información derivada para comprender integralmente nuestra gran diversidad biológica. Este liderazgo en la gestión del conocimiento sobre biodiversidad a nivel país es ahora un reto a nivel regional. El Instituto Humboldt fue recientemente seleccionado como Centro Subregional de Apoyo Técnico-Científico del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica para América Latina, que busca facilitar la cooperación técnica y científica entre 12 países de América Latina y el Caribe para avanzar en el cumplimiento de las metas del Marco Mundial de Biodiversidad Cumi-Montreal a partir del fortalecimiento de capacidades, el intercambio científico y tecnológico y la innovación. Sin lugar a dudas, se trata de una oportunidad única para propiciar acercamientos, diálogos y sinergias. Inspirados en esta designación y en la presente conferencia, quiero invitarlos a pensar en el micelio como nuestro símbolo, una poderosa metáfora de las redes invisibles pero vitales que sustentan la vida en el planeta. Así como el micelio conecta y sustenta los ecosistemas, desde el Instituto Humboldt nos entrelazamos con la iniciativa global Datos Vivos, un espacio donde confluyen las redes líderes de investigación y gestión de información sobre biodiversidad. Evocando la sofisticada arquitectura del micelio, el Instituto ha tejido durante 3 décadas vínculos estratégicos con instituciones científicas alrededor del mundo, consolidando un sistema global de intercambio de conocimiento. Datos Vivos 2025 materializa esta visión de colaboración transfronteriza, reuniendo expertos de diversos países que, como filamentos de un micelio planetario, comparten información y potencian la innovación colectiva, demostrando que el futuro de la ciencia depende de nuestra capacidad para crear conexiones que trascienden fronteras y sistemas de conocimiento, privilegiando una óptica de los intereses y prioridades del sur global. Finalmente, reitero el mensaje de felicitación por la organización de este importante evento, destacando su pertinencia y oportunidad en el marco de los actuales y futuros retos sobre la gestión de la biodiversidad y para la implementación de compromisos derivados de diversos acuerdos internacionales. El debate debe estar fundamentado en los mejores datos e información proveniente de diferentes sistemas de conocimiento con la finalidad de fortalecer las posibilidades de incidencia política y social y verificar que estamos avanzando en la dirección correcta, a partir de un conocimiento abierto, colaborativo y orientado al bienestar colectivo. Queridos participantes, tenemos la oportunidad de transformar la manera en que gestionamos los datos, la información y el conocimiento sobre la biodiversidad para lograr un mayor impacto en la sociedad. Busquemos que las reflexiones que surjan de esta conferencia se traduzcan en compromisos y en acciones concretas, efectivas, equitativas y justas. Desde el Instituto Humboldt estamos listos para asumir este desafío y contribuir de manera decisiva a un futuro más sostenible para todos. Les deseo los mayores éxitos en este logro. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Hernando. Siempre un placer escuchar esos mensajes tan inspiradores. Bueno, es un gran orgullo darle paso ahora a María Cecilia Londoño, gerente de información científica también del Instituto Humboldt, copresidenta de GeoBon y jefe de delegación de Colombia para GBIF. Adelante, María Cecilia.
Good morning and welcome everyone to my home city, Bogotá, and to Colombia. I'm very glad to see very familiar faces here in this room and during these 2 weeks that we have been sharing with many of you. I'm going to give this talk also in Spanish. We are really testing our AI system of translation. So please link to the translation service and well, let's see how this technology works for us. Primero que todo, y antes que nada, quiero agradecer a todos los que hicieron esto posible, que nos han traído hasta donde estamos el día de hoy. Quiero agradecer claramente el trabajo del operador logístico y todos los proveedores que trabajaron muy duro, además anoche, para dejar todo esto organizado para nosotros tan temprano esta mañana. Quiero agradecer a los comités organizadores, el comité directivo, el comité académico, el comité de comunicaciones. En particular, quiero agradecer a Gail, Eli, David y Javier, porque desde la distancia nos acompañaron semana tras semana para tener este programa académico que vamos a disfrutar enormemente en estos 4 días. Quiero agradecer inmensamente al extraordinario equipo del Instituto Humboldt que se puso en la camiseta y organizó todo esto, y en particular a César Gutiérrez, que ha sido el corazón de este evento. Un aplauso por todo el trabajo que César ha hecho. Quiero también agradecer a todos los patrocinadores. A la entrada, espero los hayan observado, hay un cartel a mano izquierda con todos los que colaboraron con dinero y con especie a este evento. Acérquense a él, denle una mirada y reconozcamos la gratitud de estas instituciones y estas personas. Quiero agradecer finalmente a todos ustedes por venir desde tantas partes, por acompañarnos esta semana, por hacer sus trámites de visa, aunque sé que son pocos, pero algunos lo tuvieron que hacer. Lamento mucho a aquellos que no lograron venir por ese problema. 2 personas que espero nos estén siguiendo en línea no lograron hacer ese trámite, pero creo que los datos que yo voy a mostrar ahorita de la diversidad de gente que tenemos en este salón son el resultado de un país que igual es más fácil entrar que en muchos otros donde este tipo de reuniones se hacen. Entonces, pues bienvenidos todos desde tantas partes por hacer esto posible. Bien, vamos a entonces arrancar. Estamos aquí, las 4 redes globales más importantes en manejo de datos de biodiversidad, de monitoreo de la biodiversidad. Esta imagen habla mucho de esta conferencia, de conectar las 4 redes, desde obtener datos, organizarlos en sistemas, usar estándares para ponerlos en de la mejor manera, analizarlos, hacer modelos, indicadores, pensar en tendencias y entregar esa información a quien la necesita para mejorar la conservación de la biodiversidad. Ese es el propósito de esta conferencia y vamos a tener muchas charlas técnicas al respecto de todos estos puntos. Tecnología para obtención de datos. Hay un montón de simposios de inteligencia artificial. ¿Cómo vamos a tener estas nuevas herramientas que ya están siendo parte de nosotros y que espero que en este momento estén funcionando muy bien para la traducción? Justamente mejorando este trabajo que todos hacemos. Vamos a hablar de modelos, de indicadores, vamos a estar metidos en ciencia, la que disfrutamos mucho, la que nos gusta y es un momento para compartir todas estas experiencias y conocimientos que tenemos. Es la primera vez que las 4 redes están juntas, así que tratemos de fortalecer esa alianza y esa conexión entre las 4 redes. Pero detrás de las 4 redes hay personas y por eso es tan importante estos espacios en persona. Y hay instituciones que mantienen los procesos en el tiempo y los fortalecen. Voy entonces a hablar de la experiencia de Colombia brevemente en esto. No sé dónde apuntar. Vamos a hablar de los principios de los datos abiertos en Colombia, esta cultura de datos abiertos que Colombia tiene y que nos posiciona hoy como líderes en este tema. Y por eso no es gratuito que estemos hoy acá en Colombia celebrando esta primera conferencia de las 4 redes. Este es el indicador de datos abiertos de la OCDE. No sé cuántos de ustedes lo conocen, pero habla de que tanto los países disponen sus datos, no solo de biodiversidad, sino en general. Y aquí estamos, Colombia está en este punto, en nuestra posición, que en realidad es bastante honorosa para un país del sur global, estar dentro de los primeros países en exponer datos abiertos y datos de alto valor para la toma de decisiones. Vamos entonces a entrar al tema de biodiversidad. Y vamos a hablar del CIP Colombia, nuestro nodo en GBIF. La semana pasada estuvimos en la reunión de gobierno, el entrenamiento de nodos de GBIF, y en realidad es impresionante el trabajo que esta red ha tenido. Desde la creación del Sistema Nacional Ambiental en Colombia en 1994, al Instituto Humboldt le llega la misión de tener e implementar un sistema de información sobre biodiversidad. Así que desde ese entonces Colombia está trabajando en pensar en cómo organizar la información de biodiversidad. Luego ya en el 2001 se conforma el sistema CIP Colombia como lo conocemos ahora, como una red de instituciones y actores que trabajan para fortalecer y tener en marcha ese sistema. Hoy contamos con más de 256 instituciones que publican sus datos a través del sistema. Es uno de los nodos con más diversidad de actores publicando datos. Esto habla de los principios que se ha usado en el CIP para justamente convocar a esa gran cantidad de actores y convencerlos de que es importante compartir los datos. Como este trabajo ha sido un tema de muchos, voy aquí a... ¿Dónde se cambia? Mostrarles un pequeño video sobre testimonios de CIP Colombia. I have a quick announcement to make. Please, if you are still not having the correct translation, use this QR code to have the correct one. We are on time on the agenda, so no rush. Okay, anyway, after we pass this slide, the code is available on that first door in case you couldn't still catch it. Okay, let's continue with the presentation. Entonces, como vimos en la presentación, hay unos valores profundos y unos principios profundos en el CIP Colombia y en las personas que integran al CIP Colombia. Cuando entras al CIP Colombia o haces parte de lo primero que entiendes es que no se trata de solo datos e infraestructura informática, sino se trata de personas que conforman esta red. Estos valores han estado presentes durante más de 2 décadas en el CIP Colombia. Y esto es muy importante porque ha permeado otras instancias del instituto y de este país y de otras instituciones que trabajan en biodiversidad. Así que estos principios se han pasado a otras iniciativas. Y ahora voy a hablar del BON Colombia como parte de la red de GeoBON. Desde el 2016, el instituto tiene a cargo el BON Colombia, la representación en GeoBON. Y lo que hemos hecho desde ese momento es trabajar en la implementación del concepto de las variables esenciales de biodiversidad a nivel nacional. Pero lo hemos hecho pensando también en esos principios, en trabajar con las personas y con las instituciones y generar comunidades de práctica. Biomodelos es un gran ejemplo de esto. Biomodelos son mejores modelos con el apoyo de expertos. Y aquí convocamos a todos los expertos nacionales, biogeógrafos que se han caminado este país, que saben dónde están las especies, que conocen su historia natural, y trabajamos con ellos y con modelamiento para justamente tener la mejor de las dos combinaciones, tecnología y experiencia, para tener los mejores mapas de distribución de especies y entender cómo han cambiado en el tiempo. Justo ayer lanzamos el Atlas de los mamíferos carnívoros de Colombia y trabajamos así, por grupos taxonómicos, con las comunidades de los expertos, y vamos al ritmo y a los intereses de esos expertos. Y así fortalecemos nuestro sistema y tenemos mejores resultados e información validada por ellos. ¿Dónde se cambia? Ya. Pero no nos hemos quedado solo en esos expertos. Hemos ido a buscar otras experticias, otros conocimientos, y hemos trabajado también llevando los conceptos de GeoBON a comunidades locales. Esto ha sido retador. Llegar a una comunidad local y decir hay unas variables esenciales de biodiversidad que a veces ni siquiera nosotros en la comunidad científica logramos entender. Ha sido un trabajo de mutuo aprendizaje entre esas comunidades y nosotros, y ha sido enriquecedor poder trabajar con ellos en sus sistemas de monitoreo, fortalecernos nosotros también como científicos, pero a ellos para entender mejor cómo esta información los empodera para defender sus territorios. Tenemos también toda una salida hacia un público nacional, un gobierno nacional, regional, que necesita datos en tiempo, que necesita indicadores concretos, que necesita buscar mapas, cifras. Esto lo encontramos también, lo hemos trabajado. Y por supuesto, hemos trabajado con nuestros colegas de otros países para fortalecer la manera en cómo los países y los grupos de trabajo pueden establecer las redes de observaciones de biodiversidad o los BONs. Esto me lleva entonces al encuentro de hoy, a este trabajo global. ¿Cómo podemos compartir nuestros conocimientos, nuestras herramientas, fortalecer capacidades de otros y las nuestras mismas a través de estas redes globales? Voy a pasar ahora algunos datos de quienes estamos aquí en este salón. ¿Quiénes estamos? Logramos la meta que teníamos de 1000 personas. 1005 personas se registraron a este evento. Bravo. 718 en persona y sé que hay otras que se sumarán próximamente porque se quedaron sin registrarse, pero están acá. Y 287 personas virtuales de 60 países. Y hay una participación importante, pese a que estamos en América, de países de Oceanía, Asia y África. Eso me entusiasma mucho. Así que aprovechemos esta gran diversidad que se encuentra hoy en este recinto y que vamos a compartir juntos estos 4 días. Pero también miremos con más detalle cómo se reparte esto. En la gráfica de su izquierda tenemos el porcentaje de personas que vienen de países del norte global, el porcentaje de personas que vienen de los países del sur global y el porcentaje de países que vienen de Latinoamérica. Las 3 líneas no suman el 100% porque Latinoamérica está dentro de los países del sur global. Entonces, yo sé que todas sus cabezas científicas lo primero que hicieron fue tratar de sumar esas 3 líneas y no les dio. Entonces, aclaración, si suman la negra y la azul, les va a dar el 100. Y el otro era porque queríamos ver cómo se comportaba América Latina. En la primera tenemos el porcentaje de participantes, de personas, y en la segunda el porcentaje de países. La brecha en porcentaje de personas es importante. Hay una dominancia clara. Y si pasamos esto a índices de biodiversidad, no tuve el tiempo de hacerlo, pero lo hubiera querido hacer, hay una dominancia alta de algunas especies del norte global en esta diversidad que tenemos acá. Si lo miramos a nivel de países, hay más equidad. Nos estamos acercando en las 2 líneas al final. Casi logramos 50-50 en países, pero no en personas. Entonces, creo que es importante tener esto en consideración cuando estemos escuchando las conferencias, porque claramente vale mucho la pena mirar a esas especies raras, esas especies que generalmente no están ahí casi nunca y que son difíciles de encontrar en las conferencias globales. Por favor, acérquense a sus charlas, vayan y escúchenlos, mírenlos, véanlos y traten de establecer lazos con esos países y esas pocas personas que vinieron de esos países donde hay menos representatividad. ¿Qué países nos acompañan entonces? Porque en índices de biodiversidad aquí nos podemos ir siempre mirando y mirando los datos. Acá están los países, este gráfico nos muestra el tamaño del círculo, es la proporción de personas de ese país. Casi los colombianos estamos igual en números que los de Estados Unidos, casi. Claro, somos los hospederos, los locales, es normal que esto suceda. Pero pues vemos cuáles otros países tienen una alta representación, ¿no? Alemania, el Reino Unido, Canadá, Australia, Bélgica, Noruega, nos acompañan en una cantidad interesante. Y pues del otro lado, Chile, Brasil, México también destacan. Pero bueno, quería compartir con ustedes esto porque siempre es importante saber en dónde estamos y con quién estamos. Entonces, quiero pues pasarles ese mensaje de aprovechar esta diferencia, esta diversidad y poder buscar personas que nos complementen en nuestro conocer de estos temas. Y ahora quiero hablar de esta última gráfica que tengo, que es la proporción en la organización de este evento. Estos son los comités de comunicación, de académico y el comité directivo del evento. Podemos ver que es claramente un liderazgo que tiene una dominancia en los países del norte global. Quizás esto es también un reflejo de la participación que vimos. Voy a hacer una reflexión acá. Tuvimos invitados a estos comités a varias personas del subglobal, pero se fueron, no volvieron a estar activos en estos comités. ¿Qué pasa? ¿Por qué se fueron? ¿Por qué no mantuvieron una participación dentro de estos comités? ¿Por qué no apoyaron el evento desde el principio como esperaríamos para poder haber visto una equidad en personas más grande? Hay un fenómeno que se llama la fatiga en esto de la equidad, y como mujer y como persona del subglobal que ha estado en estas redes, a veces nos cansamos. Quizás tengamos una reflexión si eso pasó en estos comités, pero es interesante ver esta gráfica. Y resultado también, tenemos nuestras 3 mujeres en los keynote speakers, eso es genial, y un hombre, pero también todos son de Europa y Norteamérica. En el ranking de clasificación no pasó ni una persona del subglobal. Entonces creo que hay que tener estas cosas en cuenta cuando organicemos nuestras próximas conferencias para que esto pues no sea un gap, y también pues pensando en los liderazgos de estas redes, cómo hacemos esto mucho más incluyente desde las decisiones. Cuatro mensajes que les quiero dejar para esta conferencia. La primera es que estas redes son una oportunidad inmensa de colaboración y de trabajo conjunto. Lo hemos notado, lo vemos hoy en el éxito de la diversidad que tenemos acá, pero todavía tenemos que trabajar más para hacerlas más equitativas y colaborativas, y no solamente conectar ese primer dibujo que les mostré, esa primera gráfica de los datos hasta la salida de información. Muy bien, todo eso pasa por algo tecnológico, de datos, pero recordemos que es de personas e instituciones. Entonces, trabajemos en conectar esas personas y esas instituciones. Esa equidad no la vamos a lograr solamente a partir de discursos y buenas intenciones. Tenemos que movilizar recursos, tomar acciones y reconocer que tenemos estas debilidades dentro de las redes para poderlas mejorar. Debemos movernos de contar países, chequear datos. ¿Cuántos tenemos? ¿Cuántos números de conjuntos? Está bien, es perfecto, son buenos indicadores, pero tenemos que también pasar a reconocer la contribución de todas las personas y las comunidades que hay detrás de esos datos y de esos datos que estamos sacando. Entonces, les hago un llamado final para que disfrutemos de esta conferencia, disfrutemos de las diferencias, de las diferentes culturas, que busquemos personas que quizás con las que nunca hemos entablado relaciones, y aprovechemos estos espacios para lograr conectar no solamente los datos, sino las personas. Bienvenidos y que disfrutemos esta conferencia todos. Muchas gracias.
Por esa reflexión tan poderosa, To Mind the Gap. Comenzamos nuestro ciclo de conferencias magistrales en datos vivos. I'm going to switch back to English to begin our series of keynote lectures here at Living Data 2025. I invite Dr. Alice Hughes to the stage. Dr. Alice Hughes has an extensive experience in biodiversity research and policy engagement. Her work demonstrates how robust data and scientific evidence can drive effective conservation strategies and inform decision-making at local, regional, and global scales. Through her research, Dr. Hughes aims to better understand the limits of biodiversity data, how it can be answered, where the gaps are, and how data can be translated into practical conservation solutions that address complex environmental challenges in diverse ecological and social contexts. Welcome.
Thank you all for being here, especially as I know that many of you will have had to have got up early when you're jet lagged, and some of you would probably rather be in bed right now. So this morning I'm going to be talking about something that will hopefully be close to everyone's heart, and that is the need for good data to inform global decision making. So what data do we need, and what do we have for global biodiversity monitoring and to feed into global and local assessments? Because we're in a time of global biodiversity loss, and unless we really strategize on having the data we need, we may not make the progress to meet future biodiversity targets. So first off, it's no lack of knowledge to everyone here that the planet is currently facing a global biodiversity crisis. There is an estimated 1 million animal and plants currently threatened with extinction. If we look at the recent statistics, none of them are good. It's estimated that since the industrial period, we may have lost up to about 2.5% of bird species. The forest area per capita has decreased by about 60% since the 1960s. The UNFAO estimates that every year we are still losing 10 million hectares of forest. We've crossed the 7th global planetary boundary, and yet we are accelerating to crossing more of them, rendering this planet into a state of irreversible biodiversity loss. And when we approach events like the COP15, we see alarming figures like this from the Living Planet Index, estimating that we have seen a 73% decline in wildlife populations around the world. And whatever we look at, whatever gauge we are using to look at biodiversity, technology, it does not always cooperate. We are not in a good place. So here is the latest global planetary boundaries, and the most recent one we crossed is the ocean acidification. And so no matter where we look, we are not headed in the right trajectory. Is there another pointer? This one is, okay. So if we look at any global index, you'll see that all the good things are going in the wrong direction, and all of the things we don't want to see, the loss of pollinators, the loss of biodiversity, is quickly spiraling into the red. But the problem is that whilst all these indices are useful, all of them are underpinned by data. And understanding the quality of that data and how representative it is critical to understanding how it can inform us in making global decisions on biodiversity. So the first basic question, how many species are there? Because we all talk about global biodiversity, and the reality is we don't actually know how many species there are on Earth. Okay, I do need a new pointer because this is not functioning properly. So there are around 2 million or so described, but the estimates vary from tens of millions to some estimates of hundreds of millions. And in regions like Southeast Asia, which I've had the privilege to call home, every year we see the description of about 200 new species. And that rate of description, these are some of last year's newly described species, including things like this spineless hedgehog here. These are charismatic species, these are vertebrates, but these are areas for which we have insufficient data and often insufficient investment in monitoring of biodiversity. And if we look at the rates of species descriptions for groups like the reptiles, we can see, looking at the IUCN Red List, that the majority of the world's biodiversity does not have an IUCN assessment. Now, this is significant because if you were to look, and I will talk more about the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Assessment, one of the main indicators for native species is the IUCN Red List. And yet, if we look at some of the most specious groups of organisms on Earth, under 1% of described species have an assessment. That means under 1% of described species are represented in the world's biodiversity framework. And that gets worse when we think about the rates of species description. So this is a rate of reptile species description in recent years. If you think we're anywhere near an asymptote, we are very far from that. There is still a massive amount we don't know about global biodiversity. So within the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as you will all know, there are 4 major goals, and I will be principally talking today about Goal A and a little bit about Goal B. So in order to identify where we need to conserve and how we can measure progress towards those targets, clearly we need to know how we can manage biodiversity effectively and how we can underpin that by data. So the first question are, where are our knowledge gaps and how far are we from being where we actually need to be in terms of biodiversity data? Thank you. Hello. Okay, that helps. So, all of you will be familiar with the IUCN, and I wanted to start off looking at the IUCN because, as I said, it is the global indicator under Goal A for species diversity. And all of you will have seen these beautiful maps. Now, the letter sequence here isn't that I forgot what the alphabet is. A is amphibians, B is birds, M is mammals, O is the dragonflies, Odonata, and R is the reptiles. Now, you would think for a global set of assessments, we would have standards, because everyone in this room knows standards are important, right? Problem is that if we look at the maps in detail, so here, panel A, that is the amphibian range boundaries in the United States. In the United States, but nowhere else in the world, county boundaries were used to delineate species ranges. If you look at panel B, that's the dragonflies, the Odonata. For the whole of the old world, river basins were used to delineate species boundaries, but not in the new world. And after I have shown this slide to people, people who are working on dragonflies have come up to me saying, I thought it was a biogeographic difference. It's an artifact in the data. Panel C, that's the reptile range boundaries. For the reptiles, they decided not to just have an expert guessing where the species were, but to use 1 or half-degree grids. So that's about 50 or 111 kilometers. And the outcome of assessments like this is maps that look like this. So this, apparently, is bat biodiversity where I used to live in southern China. Now, here, blue is diverse and red is not diverse. So apparently, those bats in Asia just didn't have a Chinese visa. They got to the border, and they weren't allowed in. Now, that might seem funny, but it's less funny when we realize that this is what is informing our gap analysis of where to conserve. Are we conserving biodiversity hotspots? Well, if we're using a map like this, we can't tell. Now, one of the reasons for this is if we actually look at the data that feeds into those assessments, what we see is major biases. So if you're a penguin or an elephant, there are literally hundreds to thousands of references in your assessment. But if you're some random monotypic passerine, there might be one reference, and it might be the IUCN guidelines from 2006. If we boil that down further, we'll see that it is massively problematic. So this is looking at the data that is feeding into those assessments. Not only do we rarely see citation of things like GBIF data, but basically only the plants are using primary data, whereas all of the animals are expert assessments. So where do I think this animal is? And this is highly problematic if you have no primary literature and you have no citation of where that information is coming from. One of the other issues with the IUCN data is an assessment is only considered out of date when it's more than 10 years old. And that means for many species, we might not have one data point between 2030 when we will be revisiting this assessment. You cannot monitor a trend based on one data point. And so unfortunately, data is rarely referenced, and a consequence of this is if we compare the IUCN data to species distribution models, we get massive mismatches. So the red area here, this is for birds on the East Asian Australasian flyway, a critical flyway annually used by about 50 million migratory birds. But that red area is where we have a mismatch between models and IUCN data. That mismatch is the yellow sea, the primary breeding area for many of these species. And so the consequence of using expert assessments that are not underpinned by traceable data is we can't make informed decisions. And when we go into this further, it is undermining our ability to understand species needs and species trajectories. So the source of information is often not cited. There are significant private databases, so it might be just a name, they have private data, but we don't know when it was collected, we don't know what it is. Now this is the major indicator for species, and yet based on basic fair and care standards, it does not measure up. Now, one of the common excuses when you say, well, a lot of these assessments, they're only citing one paper in these species assessments. And if you tell that to people, they'll say, well, there's just no data. So we decided we would also have a look at all of the species for which they only had one reference. And we found that many of those species have tens to even thousands of papers in the literature about them. So if we look at this example, this is for the reptiles, where they had literally thousands of species that had one reference. And yet that included critically endangered and data deficient species, many of which had hundreds of references that were not being used in these assessments. Let's take two of those. So this guy is a Burmese peacock soft-shell turtle, and this is a hingeback. Now these two, one of them is endangered and the other is data deficient. Yet both of them have significant amounts of data that are not being used to inform assessments. So here is our first, this is the peacock turtle. And you can see according to the IUCN, it's not actually capturing most of its range. If we look at the hingeback, you can see that actually across Africa, we have extensive data on its distribution. But with the IUCN, you will get this warning that there is no distribution data. That means that for these species, they are falling through the gaps of global assessments. And yet there is global data out there. It is just not filtering through into these assessments. The other major form of data, and I showed that impressive and depressing statistic at the beginning from the Living Planet database. Understanding species trajectories is of course essential if we're going to conserve biodiversity. But if we look, and this is the living data for Southeast Asia, we'll see that not only do we have an unrepresentative selection of species, but for 20% of all the populations, there are only 2 data points. Now, because it is drawn from the literature, that might have been the summer in one year and the winter in one year. It might have been 20 traps in one year, 1 trap in the next year. And we are using this to infer changes in populations. Now, all of you who are collecting primary biodiversity data, your studies may have fed into this index. You didn't design them to monitor populations, you monitored them to look at distributions. And yet, because governments rarely invest in long-term studies, we are pulling together whatever data we can find, and we are getting analysis which we know is unlikely to be representative of species' genuine trends over time. And so clearly we need better investment in long-term monitoring if we are to understand trajectories of species around the world. So what other data is there? I've talked about some of the most talked about data when we come up to a COP, but all of you will know that the data that we all use every day is poorly represented in these decisions. So the first question we think about when we're setting targets or measuring progress towards them is, do we have the data? Now, to make effective, meaningful conservation decisions, obviously we need data. This is from a few years ago, and I will show you an update in a few moments, but to show you broadly, the black areas on the land here represent roads. The black areas in the ocean represent seaways. The green areas represent cities, and the yellow areas represent biodiversity data. Based on this, about 90% of our biodiversity data is from 2 kilometers of a road, no matter what tax you look at. Most of it is coastal, most of it is highly disturbed, low elevation, broadleaf forests. If we subset that to look at species that don't like humans, and I can't blame them, we find the majority of their data is still far from a road. And so any type of analysis we do based on this data will overemphasize the needs of species that are good at living with us and may fail to recognize the needs of species that are more specialists. Now, in recent years, we are very lucky. Despite the fact that a few years ago, we only had a tiny percentage, about 4% of the world's land covered, hard work, including by many of the people sitting in this room, have changed those trends. And whilst the majority of the world's data is still next to a road in every continent except parts of Africa, where most of it is from going on safari and not on a road, if we actually look at what that data is and how it's changed in recent years, this is what the world's biodiversity data looked like in 2015. However, through the dedicated action of individuals around the world, we have seen a transformation. And this year, this is what biodiversity data looks like. Now, to make some of that data growth clearer, let's just zoom in. So here, the bright blue areas represent where we had data in 2015. All those dark areas are 10 years of data growth. Some of that is incidental. Some of that is the fact that we now have an army of citizen scientists around the world. But if we look at areas like Japan and South Korea, these are areas where the governments have decided, let's digitize our biodiversity repositories, and where they have gone from under 50% coverage to almost 100% in coverage. And so government action, government support, as well as other programs can help change this picture. And so when we look at our coverage of biodiversity data today, and this is at a 5-kilometer resolution, we have about 16% of the world's surface with data, which is a massive growth in just 10 years. However, the gaps do remain persistent. Parts of North Africa and Central Asia have no data and no data growth. And we can look at how these changes have happened over time. And so this is looking at it for countries, where you can see on C here, you have the countries and how little data they had in 2015, and how much progress we have made in 10 years. Part of this is because of programs like GBIF's BIFA and BID programs in Asia and in Africa, which have helped leverage data. However, getting funding and support for the continuation of these initiatives is always challenging. And that means filling those data gaps remains hard. And of course, all of these are for the land, and we have to remember the ocean. And so using data from OBIS and GBIF, we've also been looking at what the world's ocean data coverage looks like. But this poses another question. So here, your 4 panels represent 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, and 11 kilometers. If you look at any global statistic for data coverage, if you want high coverage, use coarse resolution. Because if we look for those different zones, so here the tiny blue bars are what coverage looks like at a 1 kilometer resolution, up to 11 kilometers being that yellow bar. And of course, at a coarser resolution, it looks like we have a much better coverage. But if we're doing biodiversity modeling or mapping, we need a high resolution, because that's how species move. We need to understand the interaction between species and the environment, and that means we need a high resolution. And yet, at a high resolution, most of the world's oceans still have no biodiversity data. And whilst we are seeing growth, it's much easier to see growth of data on the land, where all of you have probably gone out looking at the local birds. Some of you will have logged your records digitally onto iNaturalist or eBird. It's much harder to do for the oceans. And actually, some of the growth we have seen in the oceans is things like the tracking of elephant seals and the monitoring of penguins. And so getting representative data for ocean environments remains very challenging. And if you look at where the gray and the dim circles are, many of those are around small island developing states or parts of the Pacific Islands. These are areas that critically need biodiversity data, but we don't have data. We don't have support, and in many cases, we are not seeing the growth of that data. Furthermore, it's not just enough to say, well, 1 point in your 100-kilometer cell means, yay, we have data. If we look at the coverage of high quantities of data, we see that whilst we have seen tremendous growth, for many regions, we still only see maybe 1 point per cell. And so when we actually boil down that data and look at it in detail, in terms of good coverage, so over 50 records per cell, only 16% of cells with data have that quantity of data. And so actually, whilst we have seen a massive growth in biodiversity data, in order to monitor effectively, we still have major gaps. And in terms of good coverage, you can see from this graph at the top, the majority of cells only have a single data point. It's not that much you can do with 1 point. And so, yes, we have seen massive growth, but most of the world still does have no data at a 1 kilometer resolution, and if any of you are running species distribution models, that's probably the resolution you're using. Most of the data still comes from highly disturbed areas. This, in part, is because most of our data is now coming from citizen science, which, whilst it is fantastic for the species that are monitored, it doesn't give us data from highly intact areas or difficult to detect species, and as I will show you, most of it is birds. Most of it is highly disturbed areas near cities that are degraded, and that means that for most of the world, we still do not have representative data. And if you want to know just how much of that data is bird data, birds. So about 2/3 of our global biodiversity data is for birds. We need to work to popularize all of those other bits of this graphic. And whilst that is fantastic, it means we can monitor migration, it means we can detect vagrants. It doesn't mean a whole lot for other taxa. And so when we look at the coverage of the world for those other taxa, we still have major gaps. And it makes monitoring for the majority of species on Earth really challenging. So, let's just have a little rundown on what that data means. Does the data allow us to set meaningful priorities? Well, here is Australia. This is Australian biodiversity data. It's also an Australian roadmap. And so, while that might be great for a whole lot of species, and it probably does represent most climate zones, it's still not going to represent a whole lot of biodiversity. And this is for a high-income economy. There are major parts of the planet, like sub-Saharan Africa, where the data coverage is much poorer. And alternative sources that we often divert to because we don't have enough point-based data is often not highly reliable. So the IUCN maps, whilst commonly used, do not have the granularity of data we need to make global decisions. And those impressive numbers, as I showed you earlier, are often based on limited, unstandardized data, meaning that it is hard to infer long-term trends. Now, rather than being depressed, we need to think about how do we better use the data we have now as we work to get better data? Because we can't wait for the perfect data to make decisions. We have seen massive data growth, and that means that we need a strategy of how do we target areas to grow that biodiversity data, especially in the areas where we haven't seen data growth, which are challenging for various reasons, but how do we use the data we have now? So as I've said, there are major gaps in certain parts of the world. Initiatives have changed that for some regions, but often lack the support they need. In the oceans, many so-called filling of gaps is because of programs on single species that isn't representative, and most of our data is bird data. And most of our data is bird data from degraded areas, meaning that actually having data from highly intact, highly diverse areas is still challenging. So in moving forwards, first, understanding why we have these biases. Secondly, how do we improve the data to overcome those biases? And what do we do in the meantime as we strive to get that better data? Now, one reason for these biases is, unsurprisingly, addressing the misconceptions. So when we've stated to people that many of the IUCN assessments are not underpinned by data, they say it doesn't exist. But in many cases, it does exist. And it is biases and a lack of funding and attention that are meaning that we're just not giving those species attention. And actually, the best thing to look at next is how much funding is going into these different groups, especially groups for which we don't have data. So earlier in the year, we decided to have a look at what does biodiversity funding look like. And what we found, unsurprisingly, is if you are a mammal, particularly a large mammal, you're doing great. If you are one of these smaller taxa, you're not doing so well. So if we break that down to the mammals, unsurprisingly, the majority of funding, in fact, there is more funding for elephants than all reptiles combined, all over 12,000 species of reptiles combined, and most of it is not going to threaten species in many instances. In fact, if we think about elephants, there are contraception programs for elephants because they have literally saturated the capacity of national parks, and yet we still have no data for most species. And we see these biases in every single taxonomic group. So, of course, the insects are more poorly funded unless you're a butterfly or a bee. And in every single group, we see that a subset of species get all the funding. So reptiles don't get much funding, But if you are a reptile that gets funding, you're almost certainly a marine turtle. And that means that if we're trying to fill the data gaps, we often fund things that we already know about, whilst everything else gets left in the dark. In fact, we found the best correlates of if you get funding is basically body size and charisma, based on looking at Google Trends to see how often things get Googled. And if we look at recent extinctions, outdated IUCN assessments, and species presumed extinct, I bet most of you wouldn't realize that the species with the highest rates of catalogued extinctions and presumed extinct are freshwater snails. And yet there is virtually no funding for research on them. It was actually caused by channelization of streams in parts of the US, which we're now doing in Asia with no data on what's there. And so we have a major mismatch with a whole bunch of species presumed extinct, but no one is even funded going to look at if they still exist, whilst we fund things for which we often have enough biodiversity data to make good decisions. And so we need to make sure that we fund all those neglected taxa, so when there are genuinely data gaps, we can start to address them. So many data gaps do exist, particularly for smaller and presumed less charismatic taxa, but it's because of a sustained lack of funding. And so we need funding campaigns to popularize those species that always get neglected. Funding, as I said, is always biased, but typically to species where we already have a lot of data. Conversely, the species that we know are most at risk of extinction often struggle to get any funding to find their status. And foreign governmental funding is the worst in terms of bias. So actually, those charismatic taxa, they're not being funded by domestic governments. They're being funded, or at least they were being funded, by organizations like USID, where the funding is, well, we think that this animal in your country is important, so we'll fund its conservation. But it's a total mismatch between what is actually needed in these countries. And so having a more democratic conversation to establish the basis for funding to fill in these knowledge gaps is critical. Okay, so I've talked a lot about missing data, biased data, bad data. How do we actually move forward? Because it will take all of our efforts to address these data gaps. And in the meantime, we need to make informed decisions based on the data we have. So I've talked a lot about those biases, but how do we use the data we have now? A paper came out a few years ago that was looking at the percentage of conserved areas of global arthropods. And I looked at it, and as what happens when I look at most papers, I was like, these methods are wrong. But rather than writing to the editor and saying, this paper is wrong, and no one ever reading the paper, we decided maybe it would be more useful to actually put together a schematic to detail how we actually deal with highly biased and limited data. And so what we then did is make that framework and then map out what those outcomes would look like. The temptation when you have limited data for a species is to make a minimum convex polygon. So basically join the points together on the boundaries of species range. Great. Problem is, we have known for centuries that species have ecological needs. And if you just join those dots together, you completely ignore those needs. So here we have, firstly, a set of models based on max scent distributions of species, and B, an interpolation based on maximum richness. This is the IUCN data. This is IUCN data in this middle map at the bottom, filtered by habitat. Here we have minimum convex polygons, so those circles by doing a dot-to-dot of species ranges filtered by habitat. And in F, you have the most basic analysis that we often apply to species that we don't have good data on. All of the maps except F may be different, but they have the same patterns. F, because it's susceptible to a mid-domain effect, means that we have a completely different outcome. And yet many people, because we have limited data, default to using F because there's not much there, when we know that it will not give us the right outcome. So yes, data is limited, but whenever we do a set of analysis, we need to be careful to use data within the limits of that data. And that means understanding the assumptions and the caveats at each step. And in a world when everyone is driven to write that big headline paper, we still can't do that at the cost of doing good, rigorous science. And I mean, for me, one of the big symptoms of a bad ecological paper is it's probably in Science or Nature, where the methods are buried online and no one will look. But we all want our methods to stand up to the test. Because yes, ecology rarely has simple headlines. It's complicated. But it is all of our duty to make sure we are using data within sensible limits. So how do we set targets based on this limited data, especially for species for which there is very limited data? Well, first off, let's have a look at what those biases look like. And I'm going to use the example of bees here, just to give an idea of understanding the bias and trying to reconcile it. So here, in the first set, you have normal maps, and we have area cartograms on the other side. In the top one, we have a database richness, sampling. In the second row, we have the richness based on a database. And in the last one, we have a checklist. So those top ones are based on GBIF data and bison data and IDIG biodata and all of the different data compendiums when we've standardized the name, because as we all know, standards are critical. And in the bottom one, we have a checklist to compare it to. If we look at the amount of sampling, America is obese, Europe is fairly obese, and Asia is emaciated. If we reconcile that to richness, you can see that South America has come back, parts of Africa have come back, Asia is still emaciated. But if we use a checklist, we can see the world we should-ish be looking at. And actually, unsurprisingly, Asia is a challenge. It has 15% of the world's bee species and 1% of the world's bee data. That means any form of analysis is going to be really challenging because your data won't be representative. However, there are ways of modeling it so we can interpolate what richness should look like and help that inform our future sampling, prioritization, and also the quantification of basic ecosystem services like potential pollination. And we can do this for other data poor groups. So this is the same kind of analysis done for the termites, where despite the fact that running species-specific models is challenging, we can still get the first part of the answer whilst we strive towards better data to answer the other questions. If we look at the most sampled group of organisms on Earth, the birds, we see that there are still major data gaps. So here, red is you're doing well, you're pretty complete, whereas the green and yellow are where we still have massive data gaps. And those data gaps are the same as they are in every data set. However, and unsurprisingly, if we look at different resolutions, you can see we get a false perception of the world having much more data if we use an 100-kilometer resolution. But again, the majority of that data is coming from North America. But we can model it and subset it to map other areas, despite the fact that there are these global biases. We also need to understand what things like different indices, whether you're using Hill numbers or Shannon index or Simpson index, because all of these different indices will treat the data in different ways and will understand the biases in different ways. We also, of course, should be looking at where we have a synergy with climate data, because climate is good at getting money. Biodiversity, not so much. However, if we rely on climate to help fund areas for biodiversity conservation, unsurprisingly, we prioritize homogeneous areas to the north. And yet, if we look at a synergy between biodiversity hotspots and carbon hotspots at a regional, national, and biome level, we can actually find major synergies that could effectively protect more than 90% of species. So when we're talking about nature-based solutions, which everyone is now, we can't forget nature. That nature is not a monoculture. That nature requires intact areas. Forests sitting on peat, for example, which, again, rarely get funded, and yet are critical for both biodiversity and conservation. And that raises another critical point. 30 by 30 is already an ambitious target, but for hyperdiverse regions like Indonesia, unless we effectively protect all areas we haven't destroyed, we will lose major diversity. In terms of climate, those forests are growing on peat. If you clear them, we will never recover it. And yet when we look at where nature-based funding is going, let's plant a forest in the Sahel Desert. Let's plant 10 billion trees in Pakistan, which 20% will be non-native eucalyptus. we still have a misalignment between where we need funds and where we have funds. And the sad truth is that for those tree planting projects, there is an 80% mortality of trees within 3 years. So we are funding projects that are set up to fail, whilst we are neglecting synergies that would allow us to better reach climate and biodiversity targets. And we can take that to the next level. So within China, we have a system called ecological conservation red lines, where they look at areas for ecosystem service provision, ecosystem fragility, and biodiversity. And they subset that into all of the subclasses. And then by aggregating those together, we can actually get a blueprint for areas to protect, which aren't just about cute, fluffy bats, because your town mayor, sadly, will not understand the joys of sitting under a tree watching a bat, but will understand why he doesn't want a flood or a landslide to go onto his city. And so, of course, we need to talk a common language. We need to think about ecosystem services and areas where, if we don't manage them, we will have negative outcomes. And if we can align those with biodiversity goals, we have a much higher chance of being successful. And unfortunately, that does mean that many regions like Myanmar have a very long way to go, but using ways where we align human needs with biodiversity, we might stand a stronger chance of getting our message across. Now, I mentioned bats occasionally, and I wanted to give this as an example of developing tools that might target specific neglected ecosystems. So this is a tool that was developed by my former student, Chrysler Tanalgo, where we looked at metrics of vulnerability from a species and an ecosystem level, and then we compared that to the global data. And so if we do that, so it's based on looking at, okay, what species are present and what are the ecosystem level needs, and then mapping them out. And we did this for about 2,000 caves around the world. On the top is what you get if you use the IUCN data. So blue is kind of meh, it's kind of diverse, it's kind of threatened, you don't need to do much. It's really informative. On the bottom, you can see we have a whole lot of red caves. So red, yeah, that's when you have the flashing alert. That means high diversity, highly threatened. If you don't act now, we're going to lose diversity. Green, high diversity, not threatened yet, but maybe monitor it to make sure that it does remain protected. And so we can develop these kinds of tools for species and for ecosystems, but they rely on site-based data. There is no substitute from data on where species genuinely are. And unfortunately for groups, especially like the bats, which require expertise, getting that quality of data remains challenging. So where do we go and how do we do it better? Well, on the science side, we have to think about how we use the data that we have in a way that is consistent with its limits and respects the fact that those gaps are probably going to stay there for a while. But we also need to be responsible scientists and make sure our data goes somewhere where it can be used. In doing some of this analysis, we found that there are many government data repositories where the data is not shared, but also now Nature or your ecological journal will say, hey, do you want to share this on Figshare or Zenodo? You don't need standards. We can fragment the data, but that data doesn't go into places where it is easy to use. If we have species distribution data, the obvious place are repositories like GBIF and OBIS, where we have standards that allow that data to be interoperable and usable. If not, we just fragment that data ecosystem and we have inconsistent standards, which means that we're not growing the data, we're just putting it into 1,000 different dimensions. We can also think about other ways that we can use that limited data. So this is a new version of the human footprint, and we can actually generate this for every year to look at potential degradation and where that degradation is changing. And we can use indexes that subset diversity to try to get rid of those sampling biases when we measure biodiversity patterns. So whilst Earth observation data has improved so we can monitor much of the Earth from space, species data remains a consistent challenge. Some of these gaps are closing, many of those gaps are not. And unfortunately, in terms of taxonomic bias, if you're looking at something that's not a large-bodied mammal or a bird, then you may need to collect your own data to model much of it, especially if you're in a tropical region. And we need to change that. Preventing fragmentation of data means that we need to use these global repositories and ensure that that data is interoperable, has naming standards, etc., because otherwise that data isn't usable. And if your data isn't usable, it's not going anywhere. And we live at a time when the planet is in peril. And so ensuring that we have the data we need to make informed decisions and make sure that in 2030 we have data targets other than Target 21, which is based on data but is not necessarily specific to species. We need the species data monitoring to be based in empirical data, like the data sets being generated by the people in this room. Many other targets, like the targets on wildlife trade, also rely on species data. We talk about sustainable use, but it may boggle your minds to realize that we actually have monitoring data on wildlife trade for a vanishingly small proportion of wildlife in trade, with the current estimate of the number of species in trade being somewhere between 70 and 90,000 species. And yet for most of them, we don't know what's in trade, and we have no data on their populations or population trends, meaning any suggestion of sustainable trade being impossible to measure and gauge at the moment. Further indicators also will need to integrate this data with other forms of data, and we need to make sure we fill those data and knowledge gaps both spatially and taxonomically. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, encourage you to engage through this conference so that we can create a better global data landscape, because together we're stronger and we can start to reconcile those persistent spatial and taxonomic data gaps. Thank you all.
Hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes. We've got time for a couple of questions. Anyone in the audience wants to ask? Yeah, over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Christos Alvani did this live with Eric. That was a great, very good, and well animated, of course, presentation. I learned a lot of things. So I understand that we know at least where the data gaps are for the time being. What I would like to know as well would be what would be the cost in order to get the data we need in the land and in the ocean.
So, fantastic question. Obviously, a difficult one to answer. There are three types of data that broadly exist at the moment. There is data that is in these repositories that we can see and use and build on. There is data that is in government repositories that we know it might exist, but is not feeding into these assessments. And in those cases, that data is there, but we need to know why it's not shared, because unless we know that, we can't work at solving it. And then there is all the other data fragmented in papers and on Zenodo and Figshare that individual authors currently have to try to find and clean and standardize and then use and maybe deposit. And so understanding where the true gaps are is very challenging. However, it remains the case that the Global Environment Facility, which is the main source of funding for organizations like the CBD, rarely funds monitoring, which is a major problem because unless we monitor, we cannot monitor progress. And in many countries, when they are thinking about reducing their financial spending, the first funding to go is for biodiversity data. So whilst I can't give you a hard and fast number now, many countries are working on it, and Biodiversity Plus, and I think Petri, who runs that, is in the room here somewhere, and Europabon have been looking at the costs for Europe, and they do know what that data looks like for the European region. For regions like Asia, where we still have a lot of data gaps, and especially for areas like Central Asia, where most of the data is old. So for example, in Afghanistan, there is one spike of data in GBIF, and most of it is bacteria and fungi from one survey, so not very usable. Some countries have zero data baseline and will take a lot to develop the capacity. Others have the data, but it is not in a usable form. And so that question is challenging, but for any of you who have the ability to work on it in your countries, that's the only way we're going to reconcile these gaps. happy to talk more later.
Thank you. Is there any question from the one joining the Zoom session or not?
There's
Okay.
one person there as well.
So, okay.
Hi, thank you for that talk. That was wonderful. I'm Steve Formel from the Data Patch in Obis. I'm curious, as you go through this work, and you obviously do a lot of quality assurance to ensure that you're working with good data, what sort of feedback mechanisms do you employ to improve the quality of data that has been contributed, but just isn't usable because of maybe it hasn't been carefully curated?
So that's a really good question. And of course, for individual scientists working on it, everyone will have their own methods. When we are working on any of these forms of data, wherever possible, we work with the repository to ensure it's interpreted the right way. And I mean, you'll know that from an OBIS perspective. When you're coming at something from the outside, often understanding how data has been analyzed, where the data backbones and the taxonomic backbones are is challenging. And so normally we will take a number of steps to look at biases, to look at things like what taxonomic backbone have they used, but we also try to make sure that we talk to the data providers to make sure that we're not making basic mistakes. Because in many cases, the metadata and the information available is written by people who really know the data, but might have gaps for those who are coming from the outside. And so for anyone here, when you are using these global repositories, take as much time as possible to ensure that you understand all of those limitations, because they are essential to interpreting them correctly. And I have learned so much by talking to the people who are hosting these portals and know things that I may otherwise have overlooked. And the people hosting these portals are experts on many elements of it. Now, there are still challenges. We have Tadwig in the room as well, who are here for data standards. Those data standards are critical, because if we don't apply standards to our data, it's not usable. But having those discussions and making sure that we check things at every stage, looking at the spatial biases, looking at the taxonomic biases, using a geographic filter so that if something has had its latitude and longitude reversed, you've taken it out. There is a process that is unique to each form of data, but we do need to be very careful when we are filtering it for any of these kinds of analysis, or the statistics coming from it will be massively misleading.
Shamefully, we don't have time for any other question, but I invite you to meet during the coffee break. Thank you so much. Okay, so we now continue with our next keynote lecture delivered by Dr. Lydia Jennings. Dr. Lydia Jennings works at the intersection of indigenous data, sovereignty, environmental justice, and community-based research. Her work focuses on how inclusive data, practices, and indigenous leadership can shape more equitable and effective approaches to biodiversity research and conservation. Through her work, Dr. Jennings highlights the role of diverse knowledge systems in information science, policy and stewardship, creating pathways for indigenous communities to maintain governance over their environmental data. Dr. Jennings, please join us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Bienvenidos y los Inchingabo. My name's Lydia, as we already mentioned, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all in the homeland of the Mexica Confederacy, one of the largest and most well-organized indigenous confederacies in the South American continent. I think it's really important to recognize the land stewards of the past, present, and future, particularly as we talk about our theme today. It's a little bit tall. Can you hear me okay? There we go. As we think about how that pertains to our study of biodiversity data. Now, we've just had a beautiful presentation talking about biodiversity data at large and the many mechanisms and gaps in how we measure it. But I want to take a step back for a second and first talk about what is data, and specifically through an indigenous lens. So indigenous data is data, information, and knowledge in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities on both the collective and individual level. That can be what I think many of us are here to talk about today, information about our resources, our more than human relationships, and our environments. But it's also about us as a community. So thinking about our community from the microbial scale up to the geospatial scale, about how we think about our kinship relationships, and how that applies to modern technologies like social media. And then also about us as nations, thinking about our oral histories, our kinship relationships, the way that we self-identify, even how we relate ourselves to our homelands. So these are all elements and components of Indigenous data. Now, I think it's really important as we have this conversation that Indigenous people have always had this expansive set and understanding of data. And we're seeing that today, many of our contemporary settler-trained scientists are catching up, right? So this is a recent paper that came out in Nature Biodiversity, recognizing we should be looking at different forms of knowledge as we think about ecological biodiversity changes and how to best steward conservation efforts. So I think it's really important to highlight again how many scholars across the scale, across identities, are recognizing the vital importance of human-nature relationships. That's going to come to human or nature-based solutions, right? And recognizing the long-term relationships that people have had. I always like to say with Indigenous data, it's gone through the ultimate peer review process of surviving 10, 20 generations, as opposed to today's peer review process that's reviewed by 3 people who are trained to think in the same way. Because ultimately, we needed to have good data in order to survive our ecosystems and the shifts, the ongoing shifts that happen in our ecosystems. See if I can get this to go. There we go. So again, highlighting the fact that Indigenous people have always been data experts, have always been data creators, and have always been data stewards. Here are a few examples of traditional methods of data stewardship, whether it's on the left hand here, this is the Tono Atam, this is from down in my homelands, the Tono Atam Nation. This is a calendar stick, recording our seasonality, the different types of plants that are generating from that seasonal shifts. This up here is a Lakota winter count. So looking at the animals that were hunted, where they were captured, how many, what were the seasonal variations impacting that hunting. This up here is a quipa from the Incan Indigenous folks. And I think important to note is it was an important record keeping, tying knots in different colors and different shapes and different lengths with different materials as a way of recording dates, important pieces. And what's also amazing about this is how it was presented to community. It's a way of making their data open access, right, in a traditional capacity. This is an example of a Pawnee astronomy map from the Great Plains in North America. So again, understanding we've always had relationships with the cosmos, thinking on a variety of scales. And then lastly, this is a wampum belt. This is a belt from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the United States, made out of shells. And within it, it imported important messages as well as political responsibilities in those messages, in those processes. So again, Indigenous people have always had ways of recording our data and assigning responsibility with that data. And today, we continue to think about how that translates to our contemporary data practices. So why are we talking about this here? Well, we are constantly, as biodiversity ecologists, scientists, thinking about how we collect data from the microbial scale. I'm a soil microbiologist, so I want to make sure microbes get a call out here, all the way up to the geospatial scale, right? All of this is happening on Indigenous lands, using Indigenous waters to cool our data centers, using metals extracted from Indigenous homelands. But currently in our practices, this data is rarely connected back to the Indigenous peoples and stewards of those ecosystems. And this is a challenge for how we conduct biodiversity data, because we're not capitalizing off of the place-based expertise of Indigenous communities to make more informed ecology and biodiversity decision-making. So this is a study done by a colleague of mine, looking over 20 years of field-based research with Indigenous peoples. And what we found, we have a spectrum here. So on the left-hand side, we have very little engagement, no engagement with Indigenous peoples, building up to kind of contractual, up to consultative basis, then collaborative, collegial, and Indigenous-led. What she found over looking at through 20 years of data is that 87%, if I get these slides to work with me here, there we go, 87% of biodiversity studies were not centering the Indigenous expertise. And if it was very much on a consultative, extractive capacity. So researchers are asking the questions, and maybe they'll talk to Indigenous communities, but the communities are not centering the questions. They're not using their expertise of an area. So this comes into a question for us and our colleagues here. Are we doing science that's informed by the expertise of communities? Are we doing science that really speaks to the needs of communities themselves, who also want to have data to make data-informed decisions about their ecosystems? But there was hope. There was a handful of studies that really centered Indigenous communities, used community-based participatory practices, and really capitalized on Indigenous research governance. Now you might ask, what does that actually mean, Indigenous research governance? I talk to communities, I have good relationships with them, but I want to bring together a concept and idea, that of Indigenous data sovereignty. This is broadly recognizing the rights of Indigenous people and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. It derives from our own sense of responsibility, whether it's from our creators, our ancestors giving these responsibilities, recognizing how we have traditions and roles within our own community data protocols. It might be telling stories at a certain season, or certain information is transmitted to certain people who are supposed to have that data. And it's positioned with our human rights recognition from the UN, from our federal recognition, from treaty status, from federal court cases, and recognizing how knowledge belongs to us on the individual and collective level, and are fundamental to who we are as people. Let's see. So, thank you so much. So, you might be asking, well, Indigenous data sovereignty seems like a really broad concept. How do we actually put that into action? And this is where I want to bring in the care principles of Indigenous data governance, an important tool to really uphold Indigenous people's rights. It has 4 sub-principles, very similar to our FAIR principles that so many of us are trained in. So run first in recognizing that Indigenous people should have a collective benefit to data and the outputs, right? We know, and we're going to keep talking about today, that Indigenous communities and peoples worldwide have been heavily extracted from, especially intellectually in thinking about our ecosystems. So instead, how can we think about how communities can derive benefit from how we conduct our research practices that, again, is informed by their expertise? The next is thinking about the authority to control. How Indigenous peoples have a right and interest in the Indigenous data. It must be recognized through all forms and all stages of the data research process, of the data life cycle itself. And so we're going to talk today a bit about some of the protocols and processes that many communities are engaging with to really uphold this authority to control while also having open science. The next is thinking about the responsibility. Responsibility for community and knowledge holders who are sharing information with researchers, but also us as researchers who are engaging with Indigenous people. How do we make sure that we're doing work in an ethical capacity that does not create more harm, so that communities are going to want to continue to work with us? Because we are seeing some communities that don't want to welcome scientists in their community because of the legacy of harm that has happened. And then lastly, thinking about the ethics. So how are we centering Indigenous people's rights and well-beings in the research processes and the data life cycle? So these kind of overview of the CARE principles. You might think, well, how does that working with the FAIR principles, right? Many of us here are trained in thinking often about the FAIR principles. And I really want to highlight that Indigenous people want to be able to find their data too. Indigenous people want data to be open to some capacity. I always say open as possible, closed as necessary, because we can't find our data relationships that help us know our ecosystems if it's not findable. But we also want to make sure that it's not causing harm to our communities or have the ability to govern that. If it's a plant that might be a culturally significant plant for ceremony, for example. So I really want to highlight that the FAIR principles and the CARE principles are complementary. We see the FAIR principles as one to really help increase data sharing, which we need, but the CARE principles really bring in these considerations, particularly for non-Indigenous data creators and stewards, to bring back the people and purpose orientation to the data that we generate. Now, I also want to highlight that the CARE principles are having a national, international movement, right? Here are just a few examples of kind of regional principles. There's the CARE principles, there's the OCAP. We just see a lot of movement happening around the world of really thinking about how do we have data responsibilities that center the needs and priorities to cause no harm of Indigenous people. And so here's a few examples kind of happening internationally. We see a lot of leadership happening from New Zealand and Atawera, in Australia, excuse me, but also seeing a lot of movement happen in Canada, the United States, and Europe, as well as Asia. And then when we look at kind of some of the bigger principles and how they're being applied, the CARE principles being applied across the globe, we see kind of how it ties into a lot of the other policies that many of us are working with, whether it's Convention of Global Biodiversity, UNESCO. So again, the CARE principles are a component of really helping assert these Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous data sovereignty. The last part I really want to highlight is that when we think about mainstream data principles, whether it's FAIR, trust, open data charters, these are really centered around data principles only. But people are part of that data. Our ecosystems, our relationships are part of that data. And really, we see that the Indigenous data sovereignty protocols are the only ones that really bring back that people orientation, that people responsibility. So while these were created for Indigenous people specifically, we see that many other communities who also feel that they don't have data protections are also really upholding and bringing in the CARE principles into their scholarship and into their community practices. But you might be saying, these are all really nice ideas, but this is complicated. So let's talk about the challenges and what that means for our biodiversity community. I think first and forthright, we should start with that Indigenous communities, for the most part, are not the legal rights holders of a lot of their data, especially biodiversity data. That tends to sit in institutions and data repositories, and it's hard for communities to find where those data pertain and how they can use them to make community-informed decisions. There's also a lot of data that's missing the proper provenance. And information is missing, and especially as more and more data might go from catalog books to getting digitized, there are more opportunities for that data and provenance missing to get amplified. There are huge issues of more and more researchers than ever are collecting data specifically around traditional ecological knowledges, and what are the responsibilities that we do so? We need knowledges that are centered around Indigenous expertise, but also people are afraid of making mistakes within this process. So we know there's challenges, but that just means that we have more work to do, and we're never going to be out of a job, right? So I kind of want to go to some of the examples of how communities are navigating this, because often when we bring up these challenges, everyone, the Spider-Man meme here, because everyone just points at each other. It's someone else's responsibility. I shouldn't do this work. But instead, let's look at the ways that communities are already actively building solutions and how we as a community here at GBIF can bring together these pieces and think about how we can change our practices. So some of the opportunities that communities are creating is really developing research policies for external projects. I like to call this the Indigenous Data Governance Meta Bundle, right? And it shows on here a spectrum of opportunities, everything from kind of the less formal or informal at the top down to the more formal, and also importantly, kind of the least enforceable to the clear enforceability, right? And so many of us are engaging, if we're engaging with projects, we're thinking a lot about kind of policies or protocols that we build into our lab practices or into our research institutions. Some of you might have engaged with memorandums of understanding with communities. We also have more going into the legal side, agreements and contracts that are being developed. And then tribal nations are also building us into their legal code, their policy, into legislation. So we have a clear spectrum here of different opportunities to really assert Indigenous data governance. One example of kind of putting this into practice is this partnership with the Wabanaki tribe up in Maine in the United States and the National Forest Service. And so they did a series of agreements that really articulate a cultural protocol around the collection of sweetgrass. They've utilized visual sovereignty to put signage so people all around who ever come to visit the national park are seeing this as Wabanaki lands, this is an important culturally significant plant, this is why I can or cannot come to these places. So they're educating people while also upholding their rights. And importantly, they're building these cultural protocols and training the Forest Service staff on indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights, on education and training, on permissions to use data, on can they film footage here, and can they have Wabanaki people, how long is that going to be there, what does that mean in terms of the future use and reuse, ownership of research data, permit systems, monitoring, and what does co-stewardship look that's defined by the Wabanaki people. So just, I think, one really beautiful example that's already being applied. Another piece that I think we're going to talk a lot about this week is enriching metadata. We have some folks here from Local Context, and Local Context has really developed some really important tools, specifically labels that we can put into the data lifecycle. So they have labels around traditional knowledge, around biocultural, and also notices for those who want to engage with Indigenous data, but maybe don't know how to begin, or know that this is something that communities might want to find long term. What's beautiful about this is that you can insert these data labels into the entire cycle of the data life cycle, right? Everything from as you begin to do field site collection, as you're starting to process and do your eDNA analysis, as you're thinking about research outputs, whether it's papers or publications or something at a museum, as you put it into a data repository and how that data might be reused, these metadata labels stick with the data itself so that communities can find their data, so that if maybe you're a researcher who doesn't have a relationship with the community, but you know it might be culturally significant, there's a notice so communities can go and find that data. So I think, again, it's important that we recognize as researchers, we have a responsibility to disclose Indigenous data and collections to the communities that it pertains to. And Local Context has really powerful tools to do so, to make it easy for you. I just want to give one example that's already being applied with the University of Maine and their eDNA project. Again, this is also Wabanaki homelands and Passamaquoddy homelands. And so they have these eDNA labels, this is an example of the biocultural label, already embedded in there. So any communities who want to have access to fish eDNA data, for example, can find it. Also, it'll send a message to the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer that they have data present in the collection, so that community, again, can find that data when they need it. So a really great example. Also, here's one example happening from the European Reference Genome Atlas, where they're creating space in their digital infrastructure to put in traditional knowledge, biocultural, ethics permits. So even just creating space in our data infrastructure itself in a way that hasn't been there before so that communities can find data. And there's just an example. Okay, the other part I want to talk about is that many of us are doing site research on long-term field sites. And an important piece is that communities want to reclaim their relationships with long-term field sites that oftentimes, because of fortress conservation practices, they were banned out of. Right? And if we look at, this is one example of a paper I worked on, this is the Native Lands app, looking at the layer of Indigenous people's lands and how it pertains to these, and a variety of long-term ecological field sites that are overlapped on top of these Indigenous people's lands. And so these are many places where we can start to begin to have conversations, relationships with. So Dr. Katie Jones is going to talk about this on Thursday. I highly recommend if you want to hear more about this work. But just again to highlight, this is a field site that has been around for over 30 years, over 81 field sites in the NEON network, this continental scale network, over 180 data products, right? And they brought together a task force of an activity piece of biodiversity data and Indigenous data sovereignty to really amplify how can we bring the care principles in to our practices. What does that look like for long-term field sites? So Dr. Jones will talk more about that, but just to kind of give a little preview of our summaries and our findings, we kind of put together this wheel that really highlights some of the recommendations, whether it's assessment and communication with Indigenous communities and rebuilding those relationships with communities that have maybe been banned out of those field sites. It's also looking at how do we have site access and data collection practices so communities can embed in those data labels and find their data relationships. It's also thinking about data and specimen management. How do we make sure Indigenous peoples have access and ability to utilize that data that pertains to their homelands? And lastly, rebuilding data relationships and knowledge genealogy to their sacred ecosystems. So again, Dr. Jones will talk about this more. I highly recommend you come in and listen to the session. I also just want to give one other example. Currently doing some work with the Te Ora Fuera project. So this is a project at the South Pacific Research Station, the GUMP South Pacific Research Station. This is a place where they've been collecting samples since the 1500s. It's one of the most studied field sites in the world. And there's been no way for Indigenous people of the South Pacific to be able to find their data occurrences. So part of the Te Ora Fuera project is really to be able to build in some of these research relationships. And I think many of us here have different field sites that we work with that, again, the Indigenous communities are not recentered with those sacred ecosystems. So how can we change those practices? The next one I want to talk about is also how there are many technologies. I know we have some great members and companies here who are utilizing different technologies to increase our biodiversity monitoring. Importantly, I think we need to note that many of these are not centering these ideas of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance within them. And because of that, communities are often uncomfortable sharing their data in those spaces, so they're creating their own technologies, with Indigenous data sovereignty really centered in those practices. This is really taking my thunder away. There we go. So one example is Terra Stories, kind of an alternative to Esri Story Maps that, again, centers Indigenous data sovereignty. And you kind of see these other two app programs centering Indigenous data sovereignty into them. One of the ones I really love is Indigenous Sentinel Network. It's an example of a participatory science platform designed for a community, centering Indigenous data sovereignty, making sure community first and foremost have access to the data and decide who shares it, who gets access to that, and how can it best inform community members first and foremost. So there are many different examples of Indigenous scholars and data creators creating new technologies as well. Another example is the Waika app. This is an important app for language and oral preservation, using songs on this app that community members can use to identify specific field sites and work with scholars who are wanting to understand this, understand where to best optimize their field sites. It's a place to have songs and oral histories available just on your phone app. And I want to note that local context is also working with them on building in labels into this. So again, Indigenous data creators can find their data relationships and the physical ecosystems and also in the digital ecosystems. Another important one, I think, is thinking about relational infrastructures for sovereign data storage. So yesterday, we had a big data storage gap, right, with Amazon Warehouse Services. And so this is an example to many of really thinking about where is our data being stored, is it in alignment with Indigenous data governance protocols. And this is one that many communities are like, it's worth it to store my data in Amazon Warehouse Services, and others are wanting alternatives to that. Specifically looking at data storage that is community controlled, environmentally responsible, and at the forefront of that, grounded in Indigenous rights, protocols for the care of their data relationships. And so we have two examples that have been emerging. The Native Data Repository out of the Native Biodata Consortium, as well as Iwi Maori, both building up their own sovereign data centers on Indigenous lands, using and centering Indigenous data governance and making it available to other Indigenous communities. So again, there are alternatives that communities are leading because they often felt like technologies are not centering their expertise. Okay, these are a lot of great examples, but how does it apply to you here in the GBIF community? I really want to talk about some of the work that is being done to think about how we can bring in these opportunities of Indigenous data sovereignty into our work here with GBIF and the largest global biorepository in the world. So I don't need to tell you, GBIF has more than 3 billion occurrences. We've already talked a bit about the many different types of outputs that GBIF has. and the variety of memberships, right? Again, recognizing how many of the publishers are coming from the Global North countries. I think that was described so well in the beginning opening. Global North, Latin America is highly present, but also, is a really important piece of this, but often the leadership is not represented in these same places. So again, there are many, many indigenous populations within this region as well, and we really kind of want to bring back these pieces of how do we better incorporate the expertise of indigenous communities. So, and this is just one example I want to show, these 3 billion occurrences that GBIF has been collecting since the 1500s, right, on many indigenous homelands. And what I want to highlight with this, and these 3 billion occurrences, is that there's currently no way for indigenous people to identify their data. We'll just let that play one more time. So again, how can we utilize indigenous data sovereignty to bring back data relationships, knowledge genealogy to the many communities and many member states that have indigenous people, that work with indigenous people, that want to be better data relations and better data stewards? So, in 2014, GBIF created an Indigenous Data Task Force. 8 members and 4 alternatives representing folks from the United States, Sweden, New Zealand, and Australia, and Norway and Sweden. And I want to just ask my GBIF members on the task force to please stand up so that everyone can recognize you for your amazing volunteerism to be part of this. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. So again, this is a volunteer effort, but it again is a place bringing together indigenous people, indigenous scientists, data repository experts to really think about how can we implement the CARE principles into our practices to produce better grounded ecology and biodiversity data that also is a more ethical and relational practice. So we have been tasked, the first and foremost, we're starting with a survey that we've been doing over the last year, and our purpose rather broadly is to strengthen indigenous voices and ensure ethical use of our data. So right now we've been conducting a baseline survey to really understand current practices and current needs and concerns. You probably have seen that survey. If not, I'm going to invite you to take it again. But really with this larger goal of how can we have GBIF and work with GBIF and also data experts and indigenous experts to best define our data practices so we can give recommendations of how to implement the CARE principles, we can get the training and tools that are needed to really continue to evolve how we engage with biodiversity knowledge. And then lastly, our biggest goal really is how can we share this with our community and provide recommendations. So our long-term goals are really to monitor and evaluate GBIF's Indigenous data governance integration through creating a network of networks, of practitioners, of community members, of people who have questions, of training modules that are needed, of tools that are needed, to really educate and collectively troubleshoot. We really want to work to position GBIF to lead by example in the implementation of Indigenous data governance for everyone in the biodiversity field. So let's talk about some of the things that we've talked about in this survey so far. I think this first and foremost is looking at the roles of people who have taken the survey, what they see themselves occupy, and I think it really aligns so well with some of the conversations that we had in the early opening statement this morning, right? Majority of people are data publishers, individual researchers, and we see really very few people identify as being an Indigenous community member. And also some service developers being involved in this. When we, oh, that went ahead too much. Dang, it's really jumping my shot here. Sorry, y'all. All right, here we go. So when we actually looked at what are the regions represented, again, this is very much aligned to what we talked about today. We see a lot of representation coming from North America, from Europe, and also from Latin and Central America and the Caribbean, as well as Oceania. When we see who identifies as Indigenous people, very small percentage, right? But many are recognizing that they do work with Indigenous data, and this is something they want to learn. When we ask folks, how have you engaged with the CARE principles, the FAIR principles, or Indigenous data governance, we see in the green, orange, and blue, those are kind of people who are familiar with Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous data governance, or the CARE principles. So people are familiar, they've heard of it, but they're not sure of how to actually put it into action. And people are afraid of making mistakes, to appreciate. You want to be ethical. You want to be responsible on how you do things. This really provides an example of how we as GBIF can start leading in that. So when we really ask people, what are your needs that you might have to begin implementing these? Many recognize they want training, they want technical guidance, particularly in utilizing the local context labels. They want policies and expectations from the leadership of GBIF itself. They want case studies and examples of how it's being applied. And people are also looking at funding. I think that was a big topic in our first conversation, right? Where is the funding to make this happen? What is our guidance from our institutions or from our nation states? And this is a piece that we're all navigating. We operate in different nation states, and the politics of recognition are different in those different nation states, especially around Indigenous people, local communities, all of those pieces. And people want guidance. Lastly, I think, well, yes, I think that's fine. When we talk about what are the concerns that people have with implementing Indigenous data sovereignty in their practices, I think a really important one is people have said, it's not relevant to my work. And that's interesting, right? Because I think I've already highlighted how all of us are sampling in Indigenous lands. We're using examples of Indigenous materials in our processes. So this, to me, is one that's an education piece that we at the leadership committee of the GBIF Indigenous Data Task Force can really start to be, how do we do better education and training to help people see why this is important to their work, not just for Indigenous communities, but for many communities. The next, I think, is an interesting question of why are special considerations needed for Indigenous people? And ultimately, that they will rely on what Darwin Core puts forward, that is going to be a technical framework that they'll follow. So if Darwin Core gets on board with Indigenous data governance, so will they. I think that's really exciting, because it tells us how we can start targeting our next efforts. Then I love this one. People are curious, how do I hit the right effort between supporting and asserting Indigenous data sovereignty while also making sure that I'm having open science that's good, equitable, reputable science? And again, I just want to highlight, Indigenous people also want open science. We also want repetitive, reputable science that can be implemented. We need this as well to protect our sacred ecosystems. So again, I think this is one is like, how do we work together to really kind of piece this and show that this is complementary, not in competition? And lastly, I think this is a really important one. People are asking, what are the implications of increased legal and ethical applications in downstream, particularly as we think about how data gets used and reused across nation states, across individual communities. These are also questions, but the great thing is that with the GBIF task force, we have access to a variety of experts in this area. And I also just want to highlight that GBIF is collecting data since the 1500s. It's taken 500 years to get here. We're in the first year of this study, right? Of this, really a survey. So it's not going to be solved in a single year, but these are important considerations, not just for Indigenous people, but for many people thinking about their data practices. So I love these concerns, and if you have more, please share them in the survey. I think also, thinking about what are the biggest challenges that people have. A lot of it is that people just don't know what it is, or they've heard of it, but they don't know how to engage with it. You see that happening both on an institutional level as well as an individual level. People are really having a hard time identifying what is actually Indigenous data. You might feel like that first definition on the first slide here was just too broad. I think that's by intention. People want clear guidelines. I love that. Scientists, we want guidelines, we want steps, right? And then also just recognizing there's not a lot of tools. And I'm hoping today, by chatting with you as a keynote, I can show you some of the tools that are already being implemented. As well as people recognizing their institutional resource constraints. And I think that's broadly across science, but I think we can put these pieces in alignment to make not only better biodiversity measurement and practices, but also one that is more grounded in Indigenous research methodologies and expectations. So again, we are only the first year. So we're learning lots, and we want to continue to learn lots from you. So please come and talk to us. We have these great little handouts if you want to take the survey or continue to stay engaged. I think it's really important that a lot of people are interested in engaging with Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous data governance, and the CARE principles, but they're not sure how to get started. They're afraid of doing it wrong. And this is why we need leadership in this from GBIF, from OBIS, on how to do this and apply it properly, so that we don't have to replicate and do it again over because it wasn't done right the first time. I think importantly, we recognize in the task force leadership that we have gaps in our membership nations. And I think that some of those gaps are also represented well in the membership of this community at large, right? We don't have really anyone right now on the Asian continent. in our leadership committee. We don't have anyone from the Middle East or from India. And we only have Brazil represented. And we know, especially being here in Colombia, that there is a lot of important work being done with Indigenous people in Colombia. So we want more of you to come join us. We're going to be working out having more additional groups and tasks as are being discussed. I think over the last few days I've talked to people who are like, I'm a scientist that works with Indigenous people, but I don't think it's my space to be in this work task force. Or should it just be for Indigenous people, or should it just be for people who are doing technical expertise? So we want all this feedback because it helps us inform our next decisions, our next steps. But what I think is most important is this quote from the survey, that amplifying Indigenous knowledge through the GBRIF network would really help in widening Indigenous knowledges and expertise and Indigenous voices. And that is our goal within this work itself. So again, please come join us, please come talk to us. Please come take a survey. We want to hear more. If you have thoughts and considerations after hearing me talk today, come chat with us, come take the survey, because we want them. This is a community-led effort. Also, if you're interested, but you're not really sure to engage and you don't think that's your space, also just come and stay engaged with the work that we're doing. As we start building up these recommendations, as we start doing pilot trainings, we want to hear from you. So join our mailing list. But I also want to talk about some of the ways that we're already starting to implement these concerns and these needs in practice. So this is an example of the local context, doing kind of a pilot study with the GBIF data set. And what, importantly, is that they've started to implement some knowledge labels. You can see local context and the biocultural knowledge labels already in their data sets. So importantly, through this work, they've added over 300,000 notices into the GBIF data set in the Pacific, the Gump field station. So again, this is the first time some of those communities are getting to see their data relationships and their knowledge genealogy in the GBIF work at large. This is exciting. This is game-changing. And yet the work's not done, right? We have a lot of work to continue to do. And work to do throughout the data life cycle. So I just want to highlight some other work that's being done concurrently through our Indigenous data exchange work. This is one that's looking at guidelines for publishing about Indigenous data. This is work that will be released at the American Geophysical Union in December. We have worked with over 150 Indigenous scholars, data publishers, and data repositories to think about how do we bring the care principles into the data publishing process. And recognizing that it's a spectrum, just like many of these issues are, right? It's not a Band-Aid for one fits all. It's a spectrum depending on the needs of the specific communities. But I think importantly is that we have over 60 recommendations, a spectrum of where to start, what's the top priority and what are the downstream priorities. We already have Taylor and Francis, even before these are released, signing on and implementing these. So just one example of that is how they have, there we go, have begun to put in dual language into their publishing. So this is an abstract, a paper, and they have the abstract both in English as well as in Maori. And yesterday when I met with the leadership board, people asked, this is great that you're doing this work, but you can't just do it in English or Spanish, right? Those are still colonial languages. So how does this look like as we publish and try to think about incorporating more Indigenous knowledges, even to how the data outputs that we create? So this is a first step in doing that, right? Recognizing that sometimes these languages, our languages and our expertise of Indigenous communities can get flatlined as we translate into English or Spanish. But this is a first step and one that we're really proud of. Other part I want to highlight in some of the work that is being done is the CARE data maturity model read by my colleague, Dr. Raleigh Titanfong. So this is kind of building off of the FAIR data maturity model to really think about how can we implement and measure how we're implementing the CARE principles into our data practices. So really developing these indicators, these priorities, and ultimately guidelines. So again, I highly encourage you to check this out if you're interested in learning more about this implementation piece. And the last piece I want to highlight is how the International Electronics and Engineers Association, IEEE, sorry, I don't have my notes up here, but what's important about them is that they have been developing the first Indigenous data standard ever. And so, my biodiversity and ecology colleagues, I want to ask you, why do the engineers beat us to the punch? Right? So again, as we think about how we position GBIF to be the leader in this work, recognizing that this takes time. This took 5.5 years, but IEEE invested in doing so. And now we have this statement, and actually the full data standard will be released on November 14th, so keep your eyes out for that. I just want to kind of come to closing and think about this work takes time and intentionality and, yes, investment. Right? Many of us are here presenting today, and we're working on this individual level or on a research team, maybe in your professional society like GBIF, right? But through our intergenerational process, we're changing the standards, we're changing what is the normalization practices. And over time, we're making changes in our research institutions and our publishing practices and our funding agencies and our governmental bodies to really be able to better represent the expertise of Indigenous communities and that expertise around our ecosystems. And so I want to welcome you to join us. So my closing thoughts, remember, Indigenous people have always been experts of our ecosystems, and biodiversity monitoring needs to better center that. And us here at GBIF, we have the potential to really lead in this Indigenous data governance frameworks and the tools that we develop moving forward to not only make better and more ethical practices, but also more truth-grounded science that will be more accurate long-term. So with that, I just want to invite you, if you're interested and you want to learn more, come listen to the talks of my colleagues on the Indigenous Data Task Force. We have them obviously meet today, many on Wednesday as well as Thursday, so please come and learn more and listen more and join us in this work. And with that, Chakutesia, thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings. We have time for just one question, and we would like to give the opportunity for one of our online assistants. So, ¿quieres leerla?
Alice mentioned that a large portion of GBIF data comes from citizen scientists. Lydia is talking about data sovereign rights for indigenous data creators. Why does GBIF not have a task group for data governance for citizen science to protect and honor the knowledge and rights of citizen scientists?
Yeah, I think this is an important consideration. This is a great question. Why don't we have a task force for this? I think it's important to recognize Indigenous data sovereignty and citizen science are not one and the same. But it is a component, and I think we want to have, those are, in my perspective, those are separate categorizations and separate needs.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings.
Thank you. Please come chat.
Okay. So with that final question, we close our plenary for today. Thank you